black teenager was executed just because of his race. Another spent 8 years in prison simply for answering a question he didn't understand. One child was handed 20 years for throwing stones, and another kid sentenced to 3 life sentences for a cartel-style family murder. These are the most heartbreaking sentences for kids of all time. George Stinney Jr. Back in 1944, racial divisions in the U.S. were more than just social norms. They were the law of the land. George, a 14-year-old African-American boy, lived in a segregated town where being on the wrong side of the tracks meant trouble. And trouble is exactly what George got when the bodies of 2 white girls, Betty June Binnicker and Emma Thames, were found near his home. Enter the sheriff, who needed a suspect, and fast. George was arrested along with his older brother, but only George was kept in custody. It was clear the sheriff had already made up his mind. This innocent child was going to be his scapegoat. The sheriff announced George's arrest the very next day, claiming George Junius, and stated that the boy had confessed and led officers to a hidden piece of iron, but there was no written confession, only an officer's note. I arrested a boy by the name of George Stinney. He then made a confession and told me where to find a piece of iron, about 15 inches, where he said he put it in a ditch about 6 feet from the bicycle. George's trial was a mockery of justice. George Stinney's court-appointed lawyer, Charles Plowden, failed George in every conceivable way during the trial. Despite inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, Plowden neither cross-examined witnesses nor presented any defense. He didn't challenge the fact that there was no written record of George's confession, only the arresting officer's vague statement claiming, "He then made a confession and told me where to find a piece of iron." The prosecution presented 2 contradictory versions of George's alleged confession. In one, George claimed he killed the girls in self-defense after one attacked him. In the other, he allegedly followed the girls, attacked Mary Emma first, and then murdered Betty June. Both stories lacked physical evidence and were riddled with inconsistencies. George's lawyer, Charles Plowden, didn't bother to challenge anything during the trial. The inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, the contradictory confessions, or even the lack of physical evidence, he didn't call. Witnesses who could have cleared George, including his own sister Amy, who was with him at the time. Instead, the all-white jury, swayed by unproven allegations and racial bias, sentenced George to death in less than 10 minutes. And on June 16, 1944, George, too small for the electric chair, was executed. His final words, a simple, heartbreaking, "No, sir." While George's case happened when cameras couldn't capture moments in the courtroom, the next case on our list shows just how heartbreaking a court sentencing can be. Keandrea Cook. In June 2017, a Florida courtroom was filled with raw emotion as Keandrea Cook's mother collapsed in grief. Her cries stopped the proceedings, and the judge had to pause and repeat the sentence as everyone in the room felt the weight of the moment. Keandrea, just 18 years old at the time, was sentenced to 20 years for carjacking, 15 years for attempted carjacking with a deadly weapon, and another 15 for felony battery, all to be served at the same time. Her future seemed set in stone, and the courtroom felt the heavy aftermath. The charges against her were serious. Prosecutors said she used a dating app to lure a man and his friend to South Daytona, setting them up to be robbed. A masked gunman ambushed the pair, jumped into their truck, and fired a shot, leaving one of the men with a bullet in his pelvis. According to investigators, Keandrea and her boyfriend at the time, Kendrick Bass, were behind the plan. As her sentence was read, Cook broke down in tears. Her sobs echoed through the courtroom as she was led away in shackles. Her regret clear for everyone to see. A year later, in 2018, Keandrea returned to court. Judge Matt Foxman ruled that a miscommunication during her original plea deal had affected her case. Her sentence was reduced to 11 years in prison with 20 years of probation. This time, she stood before the victims and their families and apologized, tears streaming down her face. She expressed how deeply sorry she was and shared her hope that her story might stop others from making the same mistakes. But her story didn't end there. In 2023, Keandrea tried one more time to have her conviction overturned, but her appeal was denied. With no more options, she was left to face the consequences of her choices and the years ahead. Keandrea Cook's story left her community stunned, a young life derailed by tragic decisions. Her case drew comparisons to others like Tony Farmer, whose promising futures were also shattered by bad choices. Tony Farmer. This is the heartbreaking story of Tony Farmer, a young athlete once ranked among the top 100 high school basketball players in the country. His talent was undeniable, his potential massive, but instead of hearing the roar of a crowd on the court, Tony found himself standing in a courtroom. His dreams, once so close, were slipping away. In August 2012, Tony pled guilty to charges of robbery, assault, and kidnapping. Standing before the judge, he may have hoped for leniency, maybe probation, maybe a second chance, but the sentence hit like a brick wall. 3 years in prison. Overwhelmed, overwhelmed, Tony crumpled to the floor, unable to process the reality of his fate. The courtroom grew tense. His disbelief was written all over him.
5 years on the felony 2 conviction.
At that moment, it became painfully obvious. His basketball dreams, his shot at greatness, weren't just on pause, were disappearing altogether. While Tony's story is one of dreams lost in a split second of bad decisions, Dylan Schumacher's case dives even deeper into heartbreak. His case wasn't about a lost future, but a tragedy that couldn't be undone. Dylan Schumacher, a 16-year-old whose actions would leave one family shattered and his own future destroyed. On trial for the death of 23-month-old Austin Smith, Dylan took the stand in his own defense. Through tears, he recounted the devastating series of events that led to the toddler's death. Frustrated and overwhelmed while babysitting, Dylan admitted to slapping Austin, spanking him, and in a fit of rage, slamming him to the floor before punching him several times in the head through a pillow. Those moments of anger would prove fatal. Prosecutors revealed that the injuries caused by Dylan's actions were too severe for little Austin to survive. But while Dylan admitted to his actions, he maintained that he never intended to kill the toddler. This became the crux of the trial. Erie County District Attorney Frank Sedita III acknowledged the challenge, convincing jurors beyond a reasonable doubt that Dylan had intended to kill the child. The jury didn't deliberate for long. Less than 3 hours later, they returned with a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Dylan broke down, yet controversy surrounded his remorse. One time when leaving the court, he said this:
"Mind your own business."
In a recorded phone call from prison, Dylan was heard telling a relative, "All I have to do is cry in front of the jury, and they'll feel sorry for me." The comments sparked outrage, casting doubt on the sincerity of his tears and apologies. Was it true regret or a calculated attempt to earn sympathy? I doubt he truly meant it, don't you? Meanwhile, the next case will explain how throwing rocks could land you in prison. Tragic overpass incident. Who could imagine that a group of teenagers playing a reckless game would cause a tragedy so devastating it would ripple through countless lives? On October 18, 2017, Kenneth White, a 32-year-old father, was on his way home, riding in a van on Interstate 75 in Michigan. He never made it. A 6-pound rock came crashing through the windshield, killing him instantly. The rock wasn't an accident. It was thrown from an overpass by a group of teens, Mikaden Payne, Trevor Gray, Alexander Miller, Mark Sikelski, and Kyle Anger, who had turned this dangerous act into a game they called overpassing. They competed to score points by throwing rocks at cars. That night, they loaded up their truck with heavy stones and headed to the Dodge Road overpass. It was 17-year-old Kyle Anger who threw the rock that killed Kenneth. Afterward, the teens drove away as if nothing had happened, even stopping for fast food. They had no idea of the heartbreak they had caused. By the next day, though, as news of Kenneth's death spread, fear started to set in. Text messages between them revealed their panic. "We could go to prison for life for this. Everyone lay low and no one rat us out." Police quickly tracked them down using surveillance footage. All 5 teens turned themselves in. They were charged with second-degree murder. 4 of them took plea deals for manslaughter, while Kyle Anger pled guilty and was sentenced to 3 to 20 years in prison. Kenneth White's story is a painful reminder of how careless decisions can destroy lives. But what happens when someone's life is shattered not by a tragedy, but by the justice system itself? How about a teenager whose life took a dramatic turn after one question changed everything? Devonte Sanford. On September 17, 2007, a single question from a Detroit homicide detective changed 14-year-old Devonte Sanford's life forever. 4 people had been murdered in a drug house just 2 blocks from Sanford's home on Detroit's east side. Curious about the commotion, Sanford wandered outside where he was approached by the detective. When asked what he knew about the killings, the events that followed spiraled into a nightmare for the young teen. Sanford, barely able to understand the gravity of the situation, soon confessed to the murders and later pleaded guilty. But those admissions, he says, were coerced by police and his defense attorney. "I was young, I was just lost in space," Sanford later recalled. "I couldn't really comprehend what was going on. It all happened so fast." Within 8 months, he was behind bars for crimes he didn't commit. For 8 years, Sanford sat in prison until a breakthrough came in 2016. Michigan State Police concluded, after an 11-month investigation, that someone else had committed the murders. With the findings finally in his favor, Sanford's conviction was overturned. On June 8, 2016, after 8 long years, Sanford walked out of Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility free at last. The injustice Devonte Sanford endured highlights systemic flaws. But in Joshua Phillips' case, the horror came not from the system, but from the actions of a boy next door. Joshua Phillips. It was Election Day in Jacksonville when Sheila Clifton returned home from voting, and her youngest daughter, Maddie, dashed out the door, promising to be home for supper. Maddie was last seen hitting golf balls on her street before heading home to collect more. She never made it back. Days later, the Cliftons had just finished taping an interview with a morning news program when their neighbor, Missy Phillips, discovered Maddie's body inside her 14-year-old son, Joshua Phillips's waterbed frame. Maddie had been beaten with a baseball bat and stabbed multiple times. Joshua later told police that Maddie came over to play baseball and he accidentally hit her with the ball. When she wouldn't stop crying, he panicked, dragged her inside, and killed her out of fear of his abusive father's reaction. Incredibly, Joshua slept on the bed where Maddie's body lay hidden for 7 nights while joining search efforts. In 1998, Joshua was charged with first-degree murder and tried as an adult. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. While Joshua Phillips concealed his crime for days, the next case reveals how exposure to excessive violence can tragically influence a child's actions. Lionel Alexander Tate. On July 28, 1999, 12-year-old Lionel Tate was left in charge of his 6-year-old cousin, Tiffany Eunuch, while his mother, Kathleen Grossett Tate, babysat her. The children were playing downstairs and watching WWF SmackDown when Tate's mother told them to quiet down. About 45 minutes later, Tate ran upstairs to inform her that Tiffany wasn't breathing. The injuries Tiffany sustained were devastating. Severe bruising on her legs, feet, and neck, a fractured skull, a lacerated liver, a fractured rib, and swelling in her brain. These injuries were likened to those one might suffer in a fall from 3 stories. In 2001, Tate was convicted of first-degree murder under Florida's felony murder rule, which does not require proof of intent to kill. The law only necessitates evidence that the defendant knowingly engaged in actions that could reasonably cause harm, resulting in a death. Judge Joel T. Lazarus sentenced Tate to life without parole. In 2004, Tate's sentence was overturned, and he was placed under house arrest. However, in 2005, his troubles resurfaced when he received a 30-year sentence for armed robbery and violating his probation. While Lionel Tate's conviction hinged on Florida's strict felony murder rule, Sean Henning's case revealed how flawed forensic testimony could condemn the innocent. Sean Henning. Sean Henning was just 17 when he and his friend Ricky Birch were convicted of the brutal murder of 65-year-old Everett Carr in New Milford, Connecticut. Carr had been savagely attacked in his daughter's home, but despite the severity of the crime, no forensic evidence linked Henning or Birch to the scene. Instead, the evidence left behind, a bloody footprint and DNA, pointed to an unidentified assailant. Henning and Birch spent 3 decades in prison for a crime they insisted they did not commit. Their convictions were largely based on false testimony from Dr. Henry Lee, a well-known state forensic scientist. Lee claimed during their trial that a towel found at the scene tested positive for blood, but years later, retesting revealed the towel never contained any blood. Furthermore, no documentation ever confirmed that Lee's claim had been tested during the original investigation. In 2019, new forensic findings led the Connecticut Supreme Court to overturn the convictions, declaring that the men had been wrongfully imprisoned. After their exoneration, Henning and Birch filed lawsuits against Lee, the state, and law enforcement officials. In 2022, they reached a $25.2 million settlement with the state. As one case of concealment ends, we now turn to another, one where the tragedy was not hidden, but the motives were chillingly deliberate. McKenzie Shilla. On a quiet July night in 2022, a single devastating moment forever altered the lives of 3 young people. McKenzie Shilla, just 17 years old, drove her Toyota Camry into a commercial building near Cleveland, killing her boyfriend Dominic Russo and his friend Davian Flanagan. Both young men were full of promise, lives cut heartbreakingly short. The courtroom was transfixed as video evidence revealed the chilling final moments. Shrilla's car, speeding down a street, made no effort to stop, no brakes, no hesitation, before slamming into the unforgiving brick wall. Judge Nancy Russo commented that her actions were controlled, methodical, deliberate, intentional, and purposeful. This was not reckless driving, this was murder. During her sentencing, McKenzie, now visibly broken, read a tearful statement.
The families of Dom and Davian, I'm so deeply sorry.
Shilla was convicted of murder, felonious assault, and aggravated vehicular homicide, receiving 2 concurrent life sentences with the possibility of parole after 15 years. From a single moment of devastation to an act that shattered a family, we shift our focus to an event that left scars far beyond the walls of one school. Nicholas Cruz. Valentine's Day, a time meant for love, connection, and hope, turned into a nightmare at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. On that fateful day, 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz walked through its halls, armed not with roses, but with a rifle. He opened fire on students and staff, murdering 17 innocent souls and leaving 17 others injured. Less than 2 hours later, he was arrested without resistance. But why? Why unleash such horror? Cruz later confessed that he chose Valentine's Day because he believed no one loved him. This tragedy, however, didn't emerge in isolation. The warning signs were abundant. From 2008 to 2017, local authorities had received at least 45 calls concerning Cruz, his family, or his home. Among them was a tip just months before the massacre, describing him as a school shooter in the making. Despite the red flags, the storm still came. On October 13, 2022, after years of grief and legal battles, a jury recommended a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. The courtroom sat heavy with emotion as the decision was read. Families shook their heads, disbelief visible on their faces, and Cruz, he remained motionless, unreadable. What thoughts crossed his mind at that moment? The silence screamed louder than any words. While Cruz went after school, Nehemiah Griego decided to go after his own family. Nehemiah Griego. In the quiet South Valley of New Mexico, a horrific tragedy unfolded one night in 2013. Nehemiah Griego, a 15-year-old boy, shattered his family's world in an unthinkable act of violence. Armed with a .22 rifle, Griego first killed his mother as she slept, then silenced his 9-year-old brother Zephaniah, who awoke. He ended the lives of his 2 younger sisters as they cried in fear. Hours later, he used an AR-15 to fatally shoot his father, who had just returned from work. Griego then drove to church, telling his 12-year-old girlfriend his family had died in an accident, a lie that quickly unraveled. When the church pastor and a retired homicide detective decided to return with Griego to the house, the detective sensed something was wrong. He called 911 and the devastating reality of what had happened came to light. In court, Nehemiah Griego admitted guilt to second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. At just 15, his actions defied comprehension. Yet, as a minor under New Mexico law, he was spared the death penalty and life without parole. Instead, he was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences plus 7 years, with credit for the time already served. While Griego's actions raised numerous questions, Thomas T.J. took a different yet equally shocking path, bringing a rifle to a cafeteria. Thomas T.J. February 27, 2012, an ordinary morning shattered by extraordinary tragedy. At Chardon High School in Chardon, Ohio, a young man armed with a .22 caliber handgun opened fire in the school cafeteria. 17-year-old Thomas Michael T.J. Lane III, a former student, targeted students with chilling precision. 3 young lives were lost. 2 others were left with injuries, one so severe it caused permanent paralysis. Another suffered a minor wound, but the scars ran far deeper than physical pain. After the shooting, Lane was arrested near his car outside the school. In court, Lane faced charges of aggravated murder, attempted murder, and felonious assault. Despite his age, the decision was made to try him as an adult. In a shocking display during his sentencing, Lane wore a t-shirt scrawled with the word "killer." He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Our next case shows how taking a dark turn could lead you to prison. Jennifer Mee. In 2007, a 15-year-old girl named Mee captivated the world with a bizarre and uncontrollable case of hiccups. She became a media sensation, appearing on TV shows across the United States as she desperately sought a cure for the condition that made her hiccup up to 50 times a minute. Though Mee eventually found relief, her life took a dark turn. Mee and 2 friends, Lamont Newton and Laren Rayford, lured a 22-year-old man, Shannon Griffin, to a vacant house. Once there, Griffin was robbed and shot 4 times. Mee, though not the one who pulled the trigger, played a key role in orchestrating the crime. The crime quickly unraveled, and within hours, Mee, Newton, and Rayford were arrested. During a jailhouse phone call, Mee told her mother, "I didn't kill nobody. I set everything up. It all went wrong, Mom." Despite her claims of not being the shooter, Mee was convicted of first-degree murder in 2013. Mee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her co-defendants, Newton and Rayford, also received life sentences for their roles in the crime. From orchestrating a crime to the reckless pull of a trigger, our next case shows how fleeting decisions can destroy lives. Shondell Jackson. On a summer evening in 2009, Shondell Jackson and Derek Thomas robbed Nathan Potter at gunpoint. When the victim explained he had no money, Jackson pulled the trigger, ending his life over nothing. The investigation moved swiftly, and within weeks, both Jackson and Thomas were apprehended. For Jackson, the evidence was clear, and the trial concluded quickly. The jury deliberated for just 1 hour before returning with a guilty verdict for felony murder. On sentencing day, the courtroom became a scene of chaos. Judge Rebecca Dallett handed down a life sentence with no chance of parole parole, ensuring Jackson would never walk free again. But instead of remorse, Jackson went crazy and had to be subdued by deputies after being pepper sprayed. His lack of contrition was starkly evident. The pain deepened for Potter's grieving family when Jackson, escorted from the courtroom, turned back and laughed at them, a final act of cruelty in a case already brimming with heartache. The next video on our list shows how one young life's choices ended another far too soon. Nicholas Lindsay. On the night of February 21, 2011, Officer David Crawford, a 46-year-old dedicated family man, responded to a call of a suspicious person near Tropicana Field in Tampa Bay. Little did he know, this routine call would be his last. When Officer Crawford arrived, he spotted the suspect and got out of his vehicle, unaware of the impending danger. At 10:37 p.m., fellow officer Donald Ziegler reported hearing gunfire. Officer Crawford was found lying near his cruiser, shot multiple times at close range after reaching for his notepad. The loss of Officer Crawford sent shockwaves through the community. Over 200 officers from different agencies flooded Tampa Bay, beginning a massive manhunt for the killer. The hunt ended the following night when tips from the community led police to a home where 16-year-old Nicholas Lindsay was arrested. Initially offering conflicting stories, Lindsay eventually confessed, breaking down in tears. He admitted to throwing the gun in a nearby creek, but the damage was already done. On March 23, 2011, Nicholas Lindsay was convicted of Officer Crawford's murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While justice was served, it did little to ease the heartbreak of a family and a community that had lost a hero. As we move past one emotional loss, our next video looks into a case of unparalleled brutality. Aiden Fucci. In the early hours of May 9, 2021, a close-knit community in St. John's, Florida, was forever shattered by a horrifying act of violence. 14-year-old Tristan Bailey never returned home after an evening spent with friends. Later that day, a resident discovered Tristan's body in a wooded area, a devastating scene that revealed she had suffered 114 stab wounds. Surveillance footage showed Tristan walking at 1:45 a.m. with Aiden Fucci, a 14-year-old schoolmate. Hours later, the same cameras captured Fucci running alone, clutching his shoes. A search of Fucci's home uncovered bloody clothes, a chilling discovery that sealed his fate. Investigators found a knife in a nearby pond, its broken tip later recovered during Tristan's autopsy. On May 10th, Aiden Fucci was arrested for her murder, initially proclaiming his innocence, but on February 6, 2023, just as jury selection was set to begin, Fucci changed his plea to guilty. On March 24th, Fucci, charged as an adult, was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. While Fucci's story breaks my heart, Phillips Chism's case takes it to the extreme. Philip Chism. 2013 was a quiet year in the town of Danvers, Massachusetts, but a 14-year-old boy, Philip Chism, a student at Danvers High School, harbored a sinister secret. On October 22nd, that darkness exploded into violence. Chism attacked his math teacher, Colleen Ritzer. Chism strangled and Ritzer, then desecrated her body in a horrifying act of cruelty. How could a young boy be capable of such evil? Many asked. The trial that followed was a media circus. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer, while the defense argued that Chism was mentally ill, a victim of hallucinations. In the end, the jury saw through the facade. They found Chism guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated. The judge sentenced Chism to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The chilling violence of one student leads us to another, where a seemingly ordinary day takes a sinister turn, revealing the darkest depths of teenage betrayal. Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe. On the morning of February 11, 2023, 16-year-old Briana Ghey unknowingly walked into a trap that would lead to her untimely death. The day began with a message from Scarlett Jenkinson, asking Briana to meet her at Culcheth Library later that afternoon. What began as an ordinary meeting soon turned sinister. Lured under the guise of a drug deal, Briana grew suspicious of Jenkinson's intentions. But before she could act, Briana was brutally attacked with a hunting knife in Culcheth Linear Park. A couple walking their dog discovered Briana's lifeless body, face down and bleeding, and called emergency services. Despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene at 4:02 p.m. The following day, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, both just 15 years old, were arrested and later charged with Briana's murder. The trial revealed chilling details of premeditation, manipulation, and cruelty. Jenkinson received a life sentence with a minimum term of 22 years, while Ratcliffe was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years. Justice was served, but no sentence could undo the heartbreak or bring Briana back to those who loved her. From the tragedy of one betrayal to the eruption of violence among peers, the next video shows how grudges and guns led to another life forever lost. Alex Santiago Perdomo. A grudge between teenagers erupted into unspeakable violence near East High School in Iowa. On that fateful day, Alex Santiago Perdomo, just 15 at the time, joined a group of 9 other teens armed with 6 guns, driving into a neighborhood seeking vengeance. Their target, Jose Lopez, was caught in the crossfire along with his sister, her friend, and 2 other teens. Lopez tragically lost his life. His sister and her friend were gravely injured. At 17, Alex Santiago Perdomo stood in court, pleading guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. 4 individuals who pleaded guilty to second-degree murder faced sentences ranging from 20 to 70 years behind bars, each one bound by the weight of their choices. One member of the group, charged with providing a firearm to someone under 21, received a suspended sentence of 4 years. 2 remaining defendants faced justice as well, receiving 20-year prison sentences for their involvement. And that wraps up our look at some of the most heartbreaking sentences ever given to kids. If you're intrigued by videos like these, check out the cards popping up on your screen now. We'll see you there.